Hello, everybody, and good afternoon, and welcome to another of Select Ed's webinars on the series on the topic of selective education in London and the South East. Today's a really special one because I'm joined by two serious heavyweights in their field, intellectually, the experts in the field of 7+. So our topic today is the 7+ entry right for your child? And we'll be discussing what is the 7+, what it's all about, what type of schools offer it, how to navigate that process, preparation. We've got lots on a fairly packed agenda. So there's the contents for today. And if you have any questions as we go along, there is a Q&A box at the bottom. Please feel free to drop your questions in there, and we'll try and answer those either as we go along, or we'll have a few minutes at the end, hopefully, to try and address those as we go. So yeah, our topic today is 7+ entry right for your child, and I'm joined by two experts in their field. So first up, I have Ilana King, who is the founder of Education Pathfinder. She's also a director of the Tutors Association and an expert in 7+. I would say Ilana is, when I introduce her to other people on emails, I put that she is the expert on 7+, with asterisks around the. So what she doesn't know about 7+ entry to selective independent schools probably isn't worth knowing. And I'm also joined by Lucy Corkwell, who is similarly a heavyweight of the tutoring world. She's the founder of Osborne Corkwell Tuition, probably one of the most long-standing tutoring agencies in the London space. And also, I'd say, a hugely respected outfit, particularly in terms of children with additional needs and learning difficulties, and an area for which they are seriously respected, not just by clients and parents, but also by schools and by other tutors as well. So it's great to have Ilana and Lucy joining today. And I am simply your warm-up act and your host for today, because 7+ is really these two ladies' area of expertise. So I'm going to hand over to Ilana to kick us off by explaining what is the 7+, and giving us perhaps a little overview of some of the market trends. So Ilana, over to you.
Thank you, Adam, for that introduction. Okay, so the 7+ is fairly unique to London. It does exist in some areas of the country, but when we're talking about 7+, we really are talking about London and the surrounds. It's a selective, it's an assessment for entry into selective schools. So it is an exam that is used by many schools for entry into year 3. Now, it could be entry into year 3 into a school that goes all the way through to 18, and it could be entry into year 3 into a prep school that only goes through till 11. It exists in both of those situations. It has two parts to it. It has a first stage exam where children usually sit this as a written paper, but not always. It can be a computer-based test as well. They're testing generally English, maths, and reasoning. And then there is usually a second stage. That second stage is a group assessment and interview, and I'm going to put that in quote marks because it's not an interview in the way that we think of interviews in senior schools where it's one-on-one, but it's more of a group type interview or group assessment type activity where they're observed in the classroom. So this is the main way that it presents. But in fact, there's a little bit of variation. So as I mentioned, some schools don't do written tests. They're actually done on computers or on iPads in the first stage. Some schools test writing, others don't. Some schools test dictation, others don't. There is slight variation across lots of different schools, but essentially they're all testing the same thing. They're looking at English skills, math skills, reasoning skills, and fit in the classroom. Those are the 4 key areas that they are looking at. Now, when we think about numbers in London in particular, thousands of children take the 7+ each year. And if we're thinking of top schools in London, It can be as many as 8 to 16 applicants per place available. So the competition is enormous. I mean, one prep school recently had 440 applicants for 8 places. So we are talking about quite intense levels of competition at quite a young age. And clearly, not everybody gets a place in their chosen top school. It's just not possible with those numbers. There are quite a number of schools to choose from in London that do the 7+ entry point. However, that is shifting slightly. And if we're thinking about what are the trends and what's going on at the moment, there's a lot of change right now in private schools. And one of the shifts that we're seeing is schools that would really like to keep students there for as long as possible. Once they've got them through the door, they'd like to keep them. So one of the ways that's happening is that schools are expanding their range. So schools are either developing an earlier entry point, such as 4+, and therefore they have less spaces available at 7+, or schools that traditionally only went, so pre-prep schools that only went up to 7+, and then all the students leave and they go into other schools. Those schools are going, actually, why are we getting rid of students at this point? Let's keep them, let's extend. And those schools are actually now extending and going through till 11. So those schools, therefore, are no longer thinking, let's prep students for 7+ and help them leave, because we'd actually like to keep them. So there are less pre-prep schools around who are actually doing that 7+ preparation as well. So there's a lot of shifting going on. There's a lot of shifting in terms of the exam itself and the assessment day. So because schools want students who are going to fit that school, that hasn't changed. Over the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, schools have the same goal, the same aim, and that is to make sure that they get the right fit for their school. So to do that, they've got to really think beyond the academics. And what schools are beginning to realize more and more is that students don't always show their full potential by just looking at the tests. So there's more and more of a shift now to really looking at that second stage. In the past, most schools would invite back 2 or 3 candidates per place to the second stage. So those who had done very well on the first stage would be invited back to the second, and there would be about that level of competition. Now, schools are inviting more and more back to that second stage. And that's because they're realizing the importance of that second stage in terms of being able to really get a sense of how that child's going to fit in the school. So that second stage and that group assessment is becoming more and more important. They want children who are going to be able to thrive socially and emotionally. You don't see that through a written exam. So you can only see that through watching that child interact, doing activities, etc. in that second stage. And there is at least one school in London that actually prioritizes that stage and does it first. UCS is the University College School in North London, has that stage first. So they invite every single candidate to come in first for the group assessment. And then later on, they sit the academic. And I think that's an indication of the value they place on that second stage. So talking about the shift for a moment and the market changing, you may be sitting in here as a parent sort of thinking, okay, well, do I go for 4+? Do I go for 7+? Do I go for 11+? One of the things that I'm noticing changing is that parents are really thinking about what value the school that their child is currently at is giving them. Because with VAT being added now to fees, obviously it's more expensive, and people are thinking, okay, I'm paying a lot. Do I keep my child at this school all the way through to 11 and then change? Or actually, if I'm paying this amount of money, do I want to have a better education for my child? Do I want to trade up? And the trend that we're seeing now is more and more parents trading up. So moving from a prep school that is fine, but maybe middle tier, and trying to get into an upper tier, we might call it, a highly academic school earlier on. And of course, the result of that is more competition. So at 7+, we're seeing higher numbers, partly due to these changes that I've just talked about, shifting, thinking about, do we want to trade up to some of these better academic schools? And that is creating higher numbers again for those schools. Sorry.
Well, at this point, I was going to jump in and say, I think it'd be really interesting to get Lucy involved at this point and to put to Lucy the question of, building on what Alana's just outlined about the market and the academic preparation, what would you say are the kind of the traits of a successful 7+ applicant, having guided lots of families through this process in a similar way to Alana as well? You know, both of you have huge experience in this. So from your perspective, what are the kind of traits and character qualities of a successful and perhaps a not so successful 7+ applicant?
Well, I think the first thing to say, and probably the most important thing, is that if a child is going to go for the 7+, they need to be ahead of the game. They need to be a strong student, even at reception level. I've had tutors start to work with children, say in the second term of reception, and the tutor can already say, yes, they're on track. They're ahead in their reading. They're strong in their maths. I'm feeling confident that over the next, year and a half or so, 2 years, we can get them the right level. If a child is average, there's a chance that you might be able to get them to the right level, but then it just depends on how quickly they're going to develop and mature. Because we know children of that age, with how young they are, there is an element of chance as to how ready they'll be for that exam. Will their brains have matured significantly to realize, okay, this is something I've got to concentrate on. I'm going to have to sit down for half an hour and complete a test. And you mentioned the 4+ briefly. I speak to parents whose children have turned up for a 4+ exam and have just decided they're not interested, and have not participated in any of the activities, haven't engaged with the teachers, just because they don't feel like it. It's not to say that they're not able. They could be incredibly bright and perhaps suited to the school, but on that particular day, they just weren't feeling it. So I think that's something to really bear in mind with children of this age. Will they be ready to commit and decide, yes, I'm going to work. I'm going to work for this.
Absolutely. And I think certainly from my experience of supporting families with this process and guiding them through, it is interesting because, you can have a very, very bright child. And I think a lot of the schools that offer this 7+ entry point historically were boys' schools. There's a couple of girls' schools, but historically they were boys' schools. Of course, now there's also quite a few co-ed options. But I think particularly with boys, I find it fascinating how a boy sometimes they're just not ready at this age in terms of their emotional, or sort of, we could call it like work readiness. Like, I know that's an awful kind of phrase, but they're just not set up to jump through the hoops quite yet. Like I always think there's a young man that I worked with as a tutor later on. He's now a 13+ scholar at King's College School, Wimbledon, one of the most academically selected schools in London. He's at the top echelon of that school. He's absolutely flying. He did the 7+, didn't get in. Just wasn't ready at that point. That doesn't mean that he can't get into the school later on, or he's not a very able candidate, but he just wasn't ready at that very young age. And I was recently having a conversation with a client about her son, not doing 7+, but her son is born in August. And I think the whole summer baby phenomenon is quite an interesting one around this entry point, because if you think about it, these young children are doing this exam after reception and year 1. Really, that's basically it. They've had 2 formal years of schooling. And depending on the setting that they've been in with reception, it might really have in effect been 1 year of formal schooling if they've been in a more play-based early years type classroom. So that's 2 years, so if a child's a year older, that's basically, in terms of their education so far, they're effectively 50% ahead of the game in terms of time spent developmentally. So yeah, I think that their biological age makes a huge difference.
I'd love to jump in here because, I've worked with countless 7+ children. I don't think I could actually count them over the years. And obviously, there's been an enormous range for me. Some of them are some are born, some are not. So I'd like to I'd like to pick up on that a little bit and talk about it. And I know there is a question specifically about that as well. So, so first of all, just going back a moment to what Lucy was saying about traits. And this comes into, I think, the age as well. So to be able to succeed at 7+ requires a level of maturity and resilience that is not natural in children of that age. So if we think about just child development, and I do have a background in child development, there are certain traits that children develop at different points, and we're asking children to jump quite far ahead on that spectrum to be able to tackle this exam. So what I'm talking about with that is they actually have to have an internal drive. And if they don't have that internal drive, you are not going to be able to drag them to the finish line, which is what it can often feel like. So that internal drive in that age group, we're talking about a desire to do well. They don't have to have a mature understanding of what this 7+ means. They understand that the exam means they either go to that school or they don't go to that school, but they don't need to understand the future implications of that. There isn't that level of maturity needed. But on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, they have to want to do well on the work that they're doing. And what drives that can be different for every child. It might just be that they like to see a tick on their work. It might be they want the star. It might be that, you play a game afterwards. It doesn't have to be anything spectacular. But if that inner drive isn't there, they will not succeed. And I can say that pretty categorically, having worked with many, many students. So that inner drive and that level of maturity is a much higher indicator of success than age. So just bringing that back around to that question now. Does it matter? And do schools give consideration? And both of those questions kind of came up. So no, schools do not give consideration. The only consideration given is in the sense that no school wants a class in year 3 entirely made up of autumn-born children. That's not what any school is desiring. So they're going to be looking for a spread of ages when they actually choose children to make up that class that's coming in. So the fact that a child is summer born is not a disadvantage in that way. Some summer-born children are more mature and ready than other summer-born children. It's not necessarily about when they were born. It is really much more about their personality and development. I have worked with summer-born children who are absolutely ready for this exam and they have that level of maturity. And I've worked with summer-born children who are absolutely not. So I think that we need to take the focus away from their age because the school is not going to give you any consideration for the fact that they are a year younger potentially than some of their peers who are taking that test. And the fact they're a year younger as well, they've covered the same material at school. So they could be a year younger than someone else in their class, but they're in that same class. They're covering the same material. So in that sense, they're not at a disadvantage. Whether we think they're at a disadvantage or not a disadvantage doesn't actually matter for this exam. The reality is it makes no difference. So when we're looking, we need to be thinking about, is this child ready in other ways? And we talked about maturity and resilience. Adam, you talked about work ethic. I talk about work ethic all the time. I don't use that phrase with my 5- and 6-year-old students, but I do use it with the parents. Work ethic is something we start teaching, and I start teaching from reception. So they need to understand that when they come and sit down to a tuition session, whether that's online or in person, that is their time when they're focused. They need to understand about doing homework every week. They need to get into that pattern. So this is work ethic. It's what we call work ethic, but children don't call it that. This is part of the process. And if they can't get on board with that, then again, it's really going to be an indicator of whether they're going to succeed at 7+. And I'd say that there's another indicator as well that's really important, going back to what I was saying about the second stage. So you can have children who are mature, who have that inner drive, who have that work ethic. They do well on that first stage, and they don't on the second. And I have had students like this who kind of got through first stage for, all of the schools they applied to, and in the second stage, they don't get offered. And that comes down to the last thing they need. They really need that social awareness, adaptability, that ability to fit within the school. So it doesn't mean changing their personality. It doesn't mean changing who they are. They have to have that awareness about how they behave, how they interact with other students, with adults, that ability to listen, that ability to contribute. So it's a whole other area of development. And if they don't have that, the likelihood is they're not going to get through the second stage and actually get that offer. So we're actually asking a huge amount. And I can see, up on our slide there, resilience, determination, collaboration, peer relationship, independence. Thank you. So I didn't mention that one. Let's come back to independence for a moment. So we're talking about 5 and 6 year olds. What level of independence can they have? Well, I expect my students to have a level of independence. The parents are in charge of making time for homework, facilitating the homework, printing it out, sitting them down. But the student is in charge of doing it. And what I see that differentiates candidates at 7+ very often is those who are incredibly reliant on the adult in their house to walk them through every step of the work that they do, to be there sitting with them, to prompt them, and those that are willing to sit down and do it themselves. And the big difference comes from their willingness to challenge themselves. So there are students who are very happy to do any work independently that they know the answer to, but are not happy if they are presented with something that they don't know the answer to and they need to challenge themselves. They need to kind of accept that they have to think a bit harder, might not get it right, have a go. And it's those who are willing to have a go versus those who will not that again indicates likely success at 7+.
Absolutely. And I'm going to pick up on one of these points as well, which is listening and taking direction. And I was recently teaching year 3. So effectively you could say the product of 7+, although it was in a non-academically selective prep school in London. And it was quite fascinating. The range, even in my very small class of year 3s, the range, not necessarily of intellectual abilities. If you look down at their cognitive ability scores, they're actually reasonably well clustered. But those who had that maturity and were able to listen carefully and take direction and then act upon it independently, I thought it was fascinating because those were the children that really stood out academically at that young age. And if we look at the 7+ as an assessment, one of the schools that's very popular, certainly with families I've supported in southwest London, is King's College School, Wimbledon, the aforementioned. And as part of their 7+ exam, King's actually has a listening test where they give the children, I think it's a recorded message, and I think it's usually some sort of like a little treasure hunt or sort of almost like playing noughts and crosses. But rather than having written information, they'll say, right, you've got like a little grid or, pattern, and you have to move your sneak. It's like snakes and ladders. You have to move your sneak two steps up, 2 steps to the left, 2 steps to the right, or they might say west or east and give them like a little compass. And then they have to draw a box in that square, or they have to draw a circle or draw a smiley face or something. And it's really interesting which children at that very young age can actually do this. I feel we've got to quite a good point. And again, I think I'm going to steer this towards Lucy, and then perhaps Lucy, and then open it to you as well, Alana, which is from a sort of tutoring and preparation perspective, what do you actually need to do? What are the elements of preparation for the 7+? What does that actually look like? So yeah, Lucy, what would you say that the sort of the overview on that is?
Well, actually, I'll ping that back to Alana.
I'm happy to do that.
Currently She currently tutors, so you have it from the horse's mouth as opposed to me who's managing 7+ tutors.
I'm happy to take that. Thank you, Lucy. So the first thing that I think parents underestimate is time, and time in two different ways. Time in terms of when you start, and time in terms of the amount of time each week it actually takes to prepare for 7+. So if we think about when you start, I get parents who come to me 6 months before the exam. It is too late. Unless they're at a pre-prep school that has been prepping for 7+, which is rare, it is too late really by that point. Ideally, you want to start by the end of reception. I don't think you need to start earlier than that. They are still picking up a lot of skills in reception that will help with the 7+ preparation, but ideally towards the end of reception is a really good time to start. In terms of the amount of time that it takes, I will often have parents who say, well, on a Monday they're doing football and tennis, and on a Tuesday it's drama, and and it goes on, and there just isn't actually time in the week to set aside for this. 7+ preparation takes time beyond the tuition. So obviously tuition and every tutor does it a little bit differently. I work with my students twice a week, once in English and once in maths, but it will vary depending on the tutor that you have. So you have to actually set aside time after school for tuition, but then in addition, there's a lot more that has to be done in between those sessions. There's homework to be done in all areas. There's reading always. There can be skills like just memorizing some of the times tables. All of this is time consuming. So the amount of time that's actually needed in a week is underestimated. And I think you really have to go in understanding that you're giving over the next year and a half to this process. And it's worthwhile because you're working towards an important goal. But if you do it half-heartedly without putting in that amount of time, you're unlikely to get the result you want. So the second thing to think about is where the child is when they start tuition. And looking at the second point on the slide, the number one most important skill that they need to have is reading, fluent reading. And you say, well, hang on a minute, you're saying start at the end of reception. Are they fluent readers by that point? No, sometimes they're not. But if you want to get ahead, the most important is putting the focus on reading. Nothing else can happen without the reading. If we stop and think about it for a minute, you can't do comprehension if you aren't a fluent reader. If you aren't a fluent reader, how are you going to write stories? If you aren't a fluent reader, how will you do a word problem? So you might know your numbers really well, but how are you going to read that word problem to be able to tackle it? Reading underpins absolutely everything. So if there's anything, and if there's any parents watching this who are early in the process and thinking ahead, what you need to be concentrating on is reading. And it's going to vary enormously as to what the school is doing. So if you have a child at a state school and you're thinking about 7+, the likelihood is the reading push is not going to be as advanced as it needs to, and you're going to have to pick that up at home. I take on children who haven't become fluent readers. So I will take on children for 7+ at that point, but we will spend all of our time in our sessions on reading, because that has to come before everything else. So essentially I become a reading tutor at that point, and we can't really start 7+ until that reading fluency is picked up. Vocabulary is my number 2 on the list. If we're rating, how can you actually prepare your child? Number 1 is reading. Number 2 is vocabulary. Vocabulary underpins absolutely everything. So improving your child's vocabulary is definitely number 2 on my list. And even if you decide not to do 7+ and you go through to 11+, you're going to get a nice head start on that. It really is highly important.
I was going to say absolutely for 11 and even 13. Like I've got a couple of 13+ students who are about to do common entrance exams, and it's kind of fascinating which ones of those children actually read. And when I say actually read, I don't mean that they read they can read out the question. It means that they're really understanding and thinking about what are they being asked and what is the true meaning of this, and what and then thinking about how to respond to that in the most effective way, and having that real close reading skill. And yeah, absolutely, it just underpins everything in school.
And if we stop for a minute and think about comprehension, so comprehension is a big part of the written exams. They have to read a passage, usually a story, but not always, short story, and answer some questions. Okay, so let's go back to reading fluency. Your child may be able to read that passage, so literally read it out loud to you. So they can decode the words and they can read it. But if they don't understand the vocabulary within it, they're not going to be able to answer the questions fully because they won't have a full understanding of that passage. If their reading fluency is not quite there, all of their focus is going to be on decoding those words. So they're not going to be able to take in what they're actually reading. And every single time they go back to look at the text because they're looking for the answer to a question, they're having to decode it again because the reading fluency isn't there. So you can see how just on that one activity, if you haven't got the reading fluency and you haven't got the vocabulary, it's going to affect everything. Writing. Sorry, I'll come back to that for a minute. Most schools test writing, not all, but most do. It's usually creative writing, not always, but that is the general standard. So if you're thinking, well, what does that actually mean? What does a child actually have to write for 7+? As a basic, they need to be able to write a 3-paragraph story, beginning, middle, and end. Each paragraph 3 to 4 sentences long, showing a clear narrative that they've really understood the prompt, which can be a picture or a title or object. There's even been in the past video, they'll show them a video clip and they write a story based on that. There's all kinds of prompts, but they really need to understand what they're being asked to write to come up with an imaginative story about that with a beginning, middle, and end that flows well. Within that, they need to use vocabulary. So descriptive vocabulary needs to be in there. Their spelling, their grammar, their handwriting, all of those things. So that's an awful lot. And if you haven't got fluent reading to begin with, you're not going to have a lot of those skills for writing. How can you write a story if you can't read a story in the first place? You can see how it all kind of follows on. Verbal and nonverbal reasoning. Most schools test nonverbal. Some schools additionally test verbal, and there are 1 or 2 schools that only test verbal and not nonverbal. So you kind of need to know and ask if you've got a tutor for 7+, or you're getting a tutor for 7+, make sure the tutor knows which schools you're actually applying to, because there is slight variation. But nonverbal is almost always tested. Schools don't teach it. So state schools do not have verbal and nonverbal reasoning as part of their curriculum. So if your child's at a state school, they will not be learning this. Prep schools, if they're at a pre-prep that is prepping for 7+, they will be doing this at school. That doesn't mean don't supplement, but they will. If they are at an all-through prep school, they will not be doing verbal and nonverbal reasoning early enough. They will do it later on in the run-up to 11+. They will not do it in the run-up to 7+, because they're not preparing students for 7+. So again, you'll have to pick it up at home. If you're buying workbooks to practice, you're aiming to get to 7 to 8-year-old books. So they're aged 5 to 6, 6 to 7, 7 to 8, etc. Your child should be comfortable with 7 to 8-year-old books by the time they sit the 7+. And you might think, well, hang on a minute, because they're not going to be 7 to 8 years old. No, they're not going to be 7 to 8 years old, but that's the level that we're looking at for the top schools anyway. For maths, so the maths curriculum is very large. There's a lot to cover. And it goes, so if you think about the fact that your children are taking the 7+ in the beginning-ish of year 2, so some schools in London start as early as October, some of them are as late as February. East London in particular have February exams, and it can be anything in between. So they'll either be in the beginning of year 2 or some way into year 2. But the maths curriculum that they're tested on at the top schools goes into year 3. So they're being tested on material that they haven't covered at school, again, unless they're at pre-prep that is specifically preparing them. So we're going quite advanced. So again, you're going to have to prepare them for things that aren't necessarily being done at school. And the biggest sort of pitfall I see with parents who are preparing their children in maths in particular is they do all the calculations. They learn how to add, subtract, multiply, divide, fraction. They've learned all of this and they know the method and they know how to do it. Great. However, the big difference is those students who can actually apply what they have learned to problem solving and reasoning. So we're talking about word problems, often multi-step word problems. So it's not enough to have the maths facts. You can memorize them, and you need to memorize the maths facts. You need to know all these calculations, but you have to have a child that can actually apply them. Go back to reading for a minute. If you are not a fluent reader, and you haven't got good comprehension skills, you are not going to be able to work out what to do on a word problem in maths. So it affects right the way through to maths as well. So those are the skills. If you think about the numbers I talked about earlier on in terms of competition for top schools, what is going to differentiate those students in maths, who are going to be the top ones and who aren't? It's not who's memorized the times tables and who can do all the adding and subtracting. It's going to be those who can apply those skills to the problem solving. Those are the ones who are going to score at the top and are going to get through to that second stage.
A fantastic rundown of preparation for 7+. Thank you so much, Ilana. I'm going to jump this forward because actually we've had a really valuable question about what is the likelihood of a child with specific learning difficulties getting in and achieving through the 7+. And I think this is very much Lucy's area of expertise. So we're going to jump to this one. Lucy, oh look, Ilana, it's you as well.
No, there I am.
But Lucy, over to you on SEND and the 7+.
Yes, thank you for this question, because it's absolutely key when you're thinking about an entrance exam and thinking about choosing a school for your child. You've got to think about what is the right school for your child. And if you do have a child with SEN or they've got an EHCP, you need to really be thinking what school is going to be the right setting for my child, which school is going to nurture my child, which school is going to support them. And bearing in mind their additional needs, which school is going to have the provision to be able to give my child what he or she needs. And so if you do have a child with SEN, you have to be really careful with the direction you're going. Many of the top schools that Ilana and Adam have mentioned, depending on what stage your child is at, that young, I imagine the SEN might only have just been diagnosed or is suspected. So therefore, the strategies needed to help that child flourish in an academic environment might still be in process. So they might not be ready to sit the 7+, and therefore they might not do as well as their academic ability would suggest. So you need to decide whether your child is ready. A school, as has been suggested, schools don't make allowances for children. They want a child who is academically able and able to fit in, as Ilana was saying, socially to their school. They want a child who's a good fit for the school. They may feel that your child absolutely would work and therefore they will offer the child a place. But if they feel your child is not right for whatever reason, whether it's an SEN issue, whether it's the social ability, your child won't be offered a place. I would suggest if your child does have an SEN, then you sort of open your mind to lots of different possibilities. Don't just consider the top schools, consider ones perhaps not as academically strong. They may be a bit more flexible with their admissions criteria. But again, you've got to make sure, can they support your child if you do get offered a place? And again, there's no point going for, say, King's in Wimbledon if your child might be able to pass, but then once they're there, it's not going to be the right environment for them. They're going to struggle, and that would be desperate. That would be desperate for them. You talk about an EHCP. We would always advise, I think everyone would, if your child does have an SEN EHCP, you need to be open and honest with the school. You need to give them documentations. I was looking at Latimer, the website yesterday, and they were saying, at the point of registering your child for the 7+, you need to upload all documents relating to any additional needs. We've had clients in the past who have suggested not telling a school, for example, that their child is dyslexic. But we always say you need to be upfront and open and honest about your child's profile so that then the school can make a considered decision. We have a client whose daughter sat the 7+ recently. She is autistic, and interestingly, her academic level wasn't where you'd want it to be ideally for the 7+, but the school recognized she was incredibly bright and had huge potential. She just needed more nurturing and more support, so they actually offered her a place. So again, it's about the school that you're choosing. So you've got to be careful with which the direction you go.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And I was going to pick up on that because I guess Lucy's talked there about getting what is the right fit for your child. And I'm going to build on that and say, when is the right fit for your child? Because I think that very often, as I think we've hopefully has become clear through the course of this webinar, that 7+ is a highly competitive entry point. And in a way, it's quite an unforgiving entry point because not much allowance is given by schools. And there isn't much personalisation or sort of wiggle room on the assessment at all, even for things like there isn't really any allowance for when a child is born. So we've got, you know, I would say it's different strokes for different folks. So if we go back to this chart that we showed right at the beginning about what is the 7+ and what are these different entry points. So just because a child has not been successful at 7+ or because the 7+ isn't right for them doesn't mean that your child is destined for failure academically later on. And there is more than one entry point to academically focused selective schools. So we've got at the end of the pre-prep section, the end of year 2, that's our 7+ point going into a prep school. Well, a lot of prep schools that go up to age 11 or 13 and that are standalone prep schools, or even prep schools that are attached to perhaps slightly less competitive all-through schools, will gladly accept applications at other points than 7+. So there are, for those schools, multiple opportunities to enter a really high-quality prep school that prepares your child brilliantly for going into an academically selective senior school. Of course, the other option that a lot of families I've worked with do is that they have a child in a very inclusive, very nurturing, outstanding local state primary school. And then they'll be topping up with things like private tutors and maybe some extracurricular activities, or, you know, I know some parents do things like QMon maths outside of school, reading clubs, drama groups. All of these things are fantastic, enriching activities for young children that will help build their capacity and their capability to succeed academically later on. And of course, they could then do the 11+ entry point. So that's between primary and secondary, or prep and senior, if you want to call it that, in the private sector. And then, of course, there's even the 13+ entry point. And this wouldn't be a webinar with me on it if I didn't bang the drum for 13+. Ilana and Lucy are chuckling because they know that I'm a massive, I'm a one-trick pony. It's my massive thing. I'm constantly banging on about it. Because I do think that particularly for a slightly later developing child, it's amazing for them to be in year 6 and year 7 and year 8, you know, when they're sort of their pre-teen phase, pre-adolescence. There's so many social and emotional challenges of navigating that age that sometimes for a lot of children, it's far better for them to be big fish in a small pond. And it is interesting, even traditionally, like the London market had moved to an 11+ entry point. Bromley High School for Girls has recently restructured itself into going back to a 3-phase model. So they now have a middle school for year 5, 6, 7, and 8 to try and smooth this transition in recognition of an understanding that basically that, you know, stepping up from a primary model where perhaps you've got one main teacher, one classroom, it's the same 20, 30 kids all the time, all day, every day, suddenly going to this massive secondary school, you know, surrounded by 18-year-olds and having to go to every single different lesson, 14 different teachers, you know, one form tutor you see once a day, that's not a very healthy transition. It's just too big a jump for a lot of kids. So I would say that that understanding when is right for your child, and to go back to that the young lad of mine who's now the academic scholar, yeah, different strokes for different folks. The 7+, he wasn't ready. he wasn't ready, and that's fine, because later on he really came into his own. And actually, I think his story, to link back to what you said, Ilana, about having that inner drive, that work ethic, at the 7+ stage, he didn't have that. And in fact, I would say for him in particular, really, that drive, something just switched. Basically, I'd say about the middle of year 6, beginning of year 7 for him. And suddenly he passed the sort of the pre-test entry for King's. So clearly he's a very bright young man. But something like that gave him that extra special something happened at about age 11, 12 for him. And he was just like, I'm going to nail this. I'm going to nail this. I'm going to go and be the scholar. I know I can do it. I've got it within me. And he just really knuckled down. And he was in a prep school that had a scholarship class. So the school that he was at was the top line of that chart, like a 13+ prep. And he sort of really gunned to get into the special scholarship stream and really worked hard, did loads of preparation outside of school. And he secured the scholarship at one of London's top academic schools because he had that inner drive. And I think it all comes back to that, doesn't it? Like but yeah, different strokes for different folks. So
could I pick up on
if you don't have,
right?
Yes, so here we are. What if you don't want to do 7+, or you do 7+ and it doesn't go to plan? Ilana, I'm going to throw this back to you because I know you're
I'd like to jump
on
here on
8+.
I am. We can't discuss 7+ without thinking about 8+. And you know, my heart sinks every time I do a discovery call with a parent who wants to come to me for 8+. I think 8+ is a very, very difficult entry point, and one that I would never encourage a parent to go for. If we just go back historically for a moment, the reason we have an 8+ entry point is because there was a recognition many years ago that boys matured later than girls, and girls would do 7+ and boys would do 8+ because they needed that extra year of maturity. And there is absolutely some truth in that. However, over time, this has changed, and the number of schools that offer 8+ has diminished. So just for those who don't know, 8+ is taken a year later than 7+. It's you take it in year 3 for entry into year 4. So it's just like the 7+, but a year later. So now we have a shifting landscape again. There's always been a very small number of schools recently that do 8+, and we've had a big shakeup this year. Both Westminster Under School and St Paul's Juniors, who traditionally have been considered the top 2 boys' schools, and the top 2 certainly at 8+ entry, have just announced they're no longer doing 8+ after this next exam. So there will be an 8+ exam in this cycle that we're in at the moment for entry into in 2026, and that will be the final 8+ exam set. So that leaves very, very few schools who are doing 8+. I mean, probably 4. Maybe in London. I mean, it's almost non-existent if we take those 2 out of the equation. So my feeling on 8+, so what often happens with 8+ is that students have sat 7+ and been unsuccessful to those top schools. Often it is Westminster and St Paul's. They didn't get in at 7+ and they want to try again at 8+. When you think about that, and we think about the competition levels, there are less places available, and there are so many children going for it, and those children have already had a year or 2 years of tutoring for 7+, and now another year on top for 8+. The standards are so high. So to get in at 8+, you really do have to be one of the top students. And I think we're probably going to see it die out completely. I think 8+ is going to disappear over the next few years. With Westminster and St Paul's just not doing it anymore, I think more and more schools are going to get rid of that entry point. So bottom line is, my feeling and my experience is, do 7+. If your child is unsuccessful at 7+, then wait till 11+. Give them that time to mature, to develop, to have a wider choice of schools. I mean, at 11 plus, there will be a massive choice of schools. At 8 plus, you are going to be tied to just a couple of schools to choose from. My advice to parents always is that they don't always choose that route, but that is always my advice is to move away from the 8 plus.
Thank you very much. So yeah, there are lots of different possibilities here. So let's just quickly run through those again. So yeah, if 7 plus happens and doesn't go your way, you've got sticking with your existing school, whether that's a primary school or a prep school, until 11 plus, when there is obviously a huge range of options, because that is the main transition point. Alternatively, I guess, in the purple, you've got joining an academically focused prep school that's an 11 plus or 13 plus prep school, so goes up to age 11, so end of year 6 or end of year 8. So by that I mean sort of entering not necessarily at year 3. You know, those schools will accept applications into year 4 and year 5. Schools such as, you know, for girls, Glendower, Bute House, Kensington Prep. For boys, schools like Rokeby. Obviously my bias is southwest London, so I'm not so hot on the sort of North London, Hampstead patch. But there's quite a few of these sort of more academically focused independent prep schools. And they do have an entry assessment, but it isn't as highly contested as the 7 plus to these all through schools. I think what's going to happen to the 8 plus and indeed the 9 plus entry point, because there are a couple of schools that had that as well, I suspect what will happen is that they will get subsumed. Basically, it will stop being a formal entry point, and it will basically just become what they call an occasional place.
Occasional place, yes.
So a lot of these schools do operate what they, you know, a waiting list, and they will contact families who perhaps did sit the 7 plus, and if you're unsuccessful at 7 plus, they will say, do you want to be kept on a waiting list? And if a place comes up, and I think increasingly places are coming up, because families are quite often moving overseas, for example, or moving out of London. So I think in maybe 5 years ago even, or certainly 10 years ago, if there were no places at 7 plus, that was it, basically. You know, it was locked down until age 18. But I do think now that there probably is a greater movement within the sector.
Can I jump in there, Adam, and just say, I think that's only true when we take the top schools out. So if we're thinking about schools in my area, Highgate, they never, ever have occasional places. So there, I think when we're looking at the top highly competitive academic schools, if you don't get in at 7 plus, there is just really no hope until trying again at 11 plus. But if we look below those top tier schools, I think that's absolutely true, and those occasional places do come up all the way through.
Thank you. So what, in terms of 11 plus options, I suppose you've also got, looking outside of the independent sector, you've got the state selective sector, the grammar schools, and of course that is an 11 plus entry point only. And finally, I think a good way to round up today before we sort of close out is the whole question. This is another one of, if it wouldn't be an Adam D'Souza webinar without this point, which is on the question of academic value added versus raw outcomes. And a lot of these schools have incredibly impressive raw outcomes. So, you know, 80, 90+% A stars and A's at final A level, placement into highly renowned, outstanding. I'm not going to just say Oxbridge. Again, maybe 10 years ago, one could have just said Oxbridge. I think now a lot of these schools are advertising their placement, for example, to the Ivy League and top universities in the US, Canadian universities, Asian universities as well, Bocconi in Milan. So the top global universities. So those are highly impressive raw outcomes. But I always say this to parents, it's like, it's all very well that other people's children are getting A stars at A level and getting into Oxbridge, but what about your child? And if you have a very, very, very capable child, even at age 7, certainly at age 11 and 13, one can kind of track that flight path, if you like. And it is almost inevitable that if they do the work that they're set, that they're going to get highly impressive academic outcomes. And I think that the true measure of a good of a great school is a school which helps children to outperform what they should be getting. And in the trade, we call this academic value added, and it can be measured. It is measured by schools. It's usually not talked about on schools' marketing materials, but it's certainly something worth asking deputy heads, academic directors of studies, and even heads about if you're visiting a school. And I think that very often, particularly for those quieter children or a child who's a bit of a later developer or a child with an additional need that we've explored and touched on in today's webinar, very often the academic value add for those children is stronger in perhaps a less prestigious, less hyper-selective school. And that by the time they get to age 18, or certainly 16, 18, they're going to get better quality outcomes and higher outcomes for them in a less selective school. They will be the top of that school rather than languishing near the bottom of the so-called alpha school. So this is why I think it's really important to misquote Shakespeare, to thine own self be true, and to thine own child be true, and really thinking very carefully before you enter this process about what and when is the right fit for your child. And the 7+, I think, hopefully, as Ilana's kind of banged the drum for today, is an amazing developmental process if you go into it understanding that it is a competitive and challenging journey, but it's also a journey where if you go into it with the right mindset, and you can come out of it at the other end, regardless of the actual school outcome, having helped your child really improve their intellectual, creative, literary vocabulary, their capacity in a whole range of domains, mathematical, critical thinking skills, and that basically that is an investment that you have invested in your child's education in the widest possible sense, regardless of whether they do or don't get the exam pass at age 7. But so I hope that that's been really useful for everyone. I'm mindful
Adam,
of
could
the
I
time.
pick up on one thing? Just one thing on that. The pitfall at 7+ is to try and pick a school that is going to fit your child at 16. And this is a conversation I have with parents all of the time. So they look at those outcomes that you've just been talking about. They look at exit results, they look at A-level results, and they say, that's the school I want my child to go to. But their child is 5 or 6 years old at the time. So we don't know what is going to be a good fit at secondary for a child that is 5 or 6 years old. So I always advise, look for a school that is a good fit for your child now. Because if you're doing the 7+ with the sole purpose of ending up at the right school at 16, the number of times I have worked with students who got into school at 7+ and then they exit that school at 11+ because they have changed. So it's great to have your eye on the future, but it's not the be all and end all. Look at what is the right fit for your child now, not down the line. And Adam, there was just a really interesting question on here that I just wanted to answer that said, how many schools should you apply for at 7+? And I think it's a really important point. So I've had parents who've applied for one school and they're only interested in that one school, sometimes because it's the younger sibling of a child that goes there. I never advise that. That only works if you're happy with the school your child is at. So if they're not going to get into that school, you are quite happy for them to stay where they are and you're just chancing it. But if your child is at a pre-prep or you are unhappy with the school that they are at and you want out, do not apply for just 1 or 2 top schools. I've told you the numbers, right? It doesn't matter how good your child is. There's a chance they are not going to get in. So I always advise 4 to 5 schools and not all top schools. You need a little bit of a spread. Otherwise, you really are risking not getting in anywhere. And if you're at a pre-prep, that's a problem because there's nowhere else to go. So it's something you really, really need to consider.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. It's been, I think, an information-packed session. You'll get an email afterwards asking you for your comments. We'd be very grateful if you could just send us 1 sentence of reply. Just hit reply to the email and it will automatically come to me. And I will send it on to Ilana and Lucy. We'd be really interested to know if this was of value for you and what was that value. So this is, I'm afraid we didn't tell you that there was a price for attending today, and that's our fee. is if you could send us your one sentence comment on what was the value of today's session for you. And if you're interested in following up with any of the three of us, me for tailored educational advice, Ilana is running some
I'm going to plug my
7+
book.
mock exams. Yes, and I'm going to let you plug
So
your book.
I've got a parent's guide on Amazon that I always forget is there. But if you are a parent and you want to know how to prepare your child, it's not a workbook. It is a guide for you, step by step. How do you prepare your child for the 7+? This is on Amazon. There's a link to it on my website. And I'm also running in-person 7+ mock exams in North London that are also linked on my website. So if you want to book your child in, I always recommend, if you're doing the 7+ to actually do mock exams in person, then those are available on my website as well.
And in terms of bespoke tutoring for 7+, do get in touch with Lucy. All of our contact details are on the follow-up email that you will receive automatically in about 2 minutes' time when I hit end on this session. So thank you again, everybody, for joining. It's been a great session. And as I said, it's been full of information. I've learned lots from our two expert guest speakers. So thank you so much, Ilana and Lucy, for joining. And thank you for coming. And we'll see you at the next one. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.